Well, this is an unnecessary escalation on the part of the United States, probably because President Donald Trump is trying to improve his PR with domestic Democrats on the issue of Russian collusion, which has been disproven time and time again. But I think this goes back to President Trump wanting to beef up his anti-Russia bona fides without merit, and it's an unnecessary and dangerous escalation of foreign policy tensions. And really, we have no credibility to do this. I mean, the FBI, for example, in the last year has been implicated in the assassination of RT's founder and creator. We should be looking at ways to de-escalate, and we certainly shouldn't be taking on the foreign policy gaffes of the United Kingdom just because they're our ally.
Good to speak to you, John. Appreciate your time. I guess John Griffing, political and media analyst.
Russia has helped to broker the truce that is currently in place in eastern Ukraine. Why did the EU still go ahead with approving additional sanctions?
Well, you know what? That's a great question. And in connection with the United States and its involvement in Ukraine, I really think that this is utterly ridiculous. The hypocrisy inherent in this move is palpable. The U.S. and its European allies invade countries for any and every reason, and Russia has a legitimate energy interest in preserving peace and stability in Ukraine. Its pipeline is the sole pipeline to supply oil and natural gas to most of Western Europe, so this is highly counterproductive to the interests of both the European Union, the United States, and Russia itself. And I think many of us across the pond would like to see us move in the other direction. Well, beyond the issue of peace is the fact that we have instability in financial markets, and the Russian Federation has said that it will be forming a currency zone with China, and it will be diversifying away from dollars, and this could ripple throughout the U.S. market, the European markets, and cause substantial financial turmoil. And this is something we need to be thinking about in the European Union and the United States before we advocate and pursue new sanctions. As far as peace on the ground, I think Russia wants peace. I think the people of Ukraine simply want to go back to business as usual. This is not World War II. This is not Lebensraum, as some have said. This is not imperialism. This is simply Russia protecting its energy interests, and the United States and Europe should be encouraging this, move towards stability, not trying to punish Russia, not trying to punish the economies of all of our nations and our consumers with these types of really counterproductive moves. Very much, and I'm an advocate of a new Plaza Accord or Louvre Accord that would adjust the consumer balance across the G20 because I think we've reached a fever pitch where the U.S. dollar is no longer able to be used as an imperial tool, and other nations are looking at their options. I know that Russia is now looking at using its own currency. China's looking at using its own currency in international trade, and this has rebalanced things substantially. Our consumers, our consumers aren't the only consumers anymore. Chinese consumers number some 300 million. That's their middle class, according to one estimate. That's as large as the entire U.S. population. So the U.S. and the European Union are no longer in the position to make these types of grandiose unconditional threats. We have to begin looking at things that advance the interests of peace for all countries involved in the region. And as you said, we don't feel these sanctions. In many cases, Russia doesn't feel these sanctions. It's entirely ludicrous in a globalized marketplace for us to be using 19th century tools.
Time to change how we do business. That's John Griffing there, Republican politicians in Texas. Thank you very much for your time and your thoughts on this.
And that's the worry. Investigative reporter John Griffing says that this lack of education and all the other problems could lead to more terrorism.
As far as underdeveloped countries, corrupt dictatorships, there's an active effort to steal aid money, and that deprives people at the worst possible place in their lives of the support and the assistance that they need. And look at terrorism in the region. People who get involved with terrorism are usually the same kind of people who would be involved with violent crime on our streets in Western countries. They're disadvantaged use. They're people that need a reason to exist. They need a purpose. They haven't been able to find that purpose in traditional means like employment or study because those things aren't available to them. So they turn to violence. They turn to terrorism. So that's a very real risk if we don't make sure that these refugees are educated. Well, yes, he's absolutely correct, because in the Democrat memo, which is a few pages long, all they do is say that they started their investigation without evidence, 7 weeks to be precise. Prior to getting the Steele dossier, they started their investigation. If you remember at the time, Senator Dianne Feinstein said we have to start an investigation to find out why we have to investigate. Never before in the annals of jurisprudence have you ever seen an investigation start without probable cause, without sufficient evidence. So they essentially admitted to not having evidence and to pursuing this investigation without evidence, in other words, they got lucky with the Steele dossier, at least they thought they did, and they used that 7 weeks in. So you're not talking about a long period of time between the time that the Democrats initiated this investigation and they used the Steele dossier. It's not an eternity here. So this is not something that the Republicans have done to the FBI. This is a culture of corruption at the FBI, and the FBI has done this to itself. Well, it was very important. The Democrat rebuttal, all it says is that the Steele dossier wasn't used until 7 weeks into the investigation. That's actually a very short window of time. What that means is they didn't have sufficient evidence to start their investigation. They started their investigation and then latched on to the Steele dossier in order to make their erroneous claims that Trump was somehow selling out U.S. elections to Russia. Now, that's even worse than basing the entire investigation on the Steele dossier. That's essentially saying, well, look, we lucked out. We got this Hillary-funded Steele dossier midway in, and we put everything around that. Well, that doesn't make a better or stronger argument that Russia hacked U.S. elections. And as a matter of fact, the entire Democrat rebuttal is essentially a series of no it isn't, of contradictions, of contrarian claims. They're saying, no, it isn't. No, we didn't do this. No, we didn't abuse U.S. intelligence gathering processes. But yes, they did. And it wasn't just Carter Page. There were multiple instances of unmasking, improper unmasking of Trump officials, of Trump campaign officials. So this is not something that is a new problem. It's an ongoing culture of corruption, and all the Democrat memo does is call more attention to it.
What do you mean?
Oh, no question. A good percentage of this is partisan bickering. Hands down, concede. However, that doesn't negate the factual content of the Republican memo and the many instances of established abuse of the FBI and abuse of FISA that were demonstrated by the Republicans prior to the Nunes memo. So we're dealing, for example, the National Security Advisor under Obama going in to the office, entering her code, and unmasking improperly top campaign officials, okay? This is not something that is just about Carter Page. It's not just about the Nunes memo. It's about a culture of corruption. Yes, this is taking place around political parties in an entirely contentious scenario, no doubt, but this is not just partisan. It's about principle, and we need to get back to discussions about principle.
All right. John Griffing, thanks for being with us on RT International. We'll have more news after a break.
This is really tragic to see this Democratic congressman now, essentially now drinking the Kool-Aid and doing his party's mudslinging. Schiff is correct in his previous statement in 2013 when he says there are issues with the abuse of the FISA courts. Now, his current position is certainly more political than anything else. The Nunes memo is quite mild in what it actually shows. Compared to the large number of serious abuses of U.S. civil liberties that go on every day. It's really a step down from the position of principle he had taken previously, and it's nothing more than political gamesmanship. No, and this is really growing quite tiring. Will the little green men and conspiracy theories ever cease? This is the same party that for the last 50 years engaged in open treason with the Soviet Union. So the Democrats have a massive double standard when it comes to election intervention. President Obama intervened in the Ukrainian elections, intervened in the Israeli elections. I mean, this is clearly not a party that actually believes in election integrity. They believe in winning and in keeping power, and that's a very different issue. And the Democrats have been engaging in neo-McCarthyism. It's kind of switched the roles here. From 50 years ago, they were taking the fifth because they were being called to the mat for collaborating themselves with the Soviet Union. It's become a little silly. It's become a little ridiculous. This is a broken record. We need to actually have a real conversation about the real data and the real facts and not about this fantasy.
All right, very interesting to hear your thoughts. Political analyst John Griffin, thanks for being with us here on RT International.
Well, look, I grew up with Looney Tunes. Who doesn't remember the number of things that Looney Tunes made light of, including speech impediments? These are things that today would send parents and activist groups screaming from the room, demanding sensitivity. And look, I have, again, as I said, I had asthma growing up. There's nothing unserious about asthma. It's definitely a serious thing. Nonetheless, this is an issue of Hollywood license rather than snowflake sensitivity.
John, yeah, go ahead. You wanted to respond.
Wait a minute. Why does that assume bullying? Why do we assume that the consequence of showing this in a film is going to be bullying? By laughing at our own problems and our own challenges, we actually can encourage education about them rather than discourage bullying. I think bullying is a misplaced focus here. In that case, we need to ban viewing of Mrs. Doubtfire for the cayenne pepper scene towards the end of the film. I mean, we can just simply not take our children to movies we feel are inappropriate for them. And furthermore, the idea that we assume that this is going to lead to bullying is a false premise. It's a false dichotomy. Why must this lead to bullying? Why can't it simply be an isolated scene in a film that we teach our children to interpret one way or another? But if we assume the premise that yes, that this is a damaging scene and that it might lead children to weaponize, biologically weaponize allergens in school, then I would at least point out that parents should give proper context to this scene when it is viewed by their children, if it is viewed, and that's the responsibility of parents, not the marketplace, to solve. The Hollywood license and Hollywood values are not necessarily going to reflect those of the larger viewing public. And it's incumbent on parents, and it's their responsibility to decide not only what their children see in theaters, but to explain it to them and to give them proper context.
A U.S. Disability Rights Foundation has hit out at film directors for failing to cast people with disabilities to portray the disabled. The group's president says it's offensive and humiliates actors with disabilities, a group of whom have accused directors of discrimination. However, some think the problem is being exaggerated.
Are you stupid or something? You are no different.
Your boy's different.
My boy Forrest is going to get the same opportunities as everyone else.
I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is.
Get in here, you idiot. Get out my dress blues. They're in a garment bag in the closet.
Are we going someplace, Colonel?
What business is that of yours? Don't shrug, you imbecile. I'm blind.
Fais ce que je veux. Aucune pitié.
Voilà, c'est bon comme ça?
Attends.
In the 30 years since my Oscar win, why no other actor with a disability has appeared in a leading role in a major motion picture. It is clear to us that having actors playing disabled is inauthentic and to many, particularly to deaf community, culturally offensive.
When we go down that road towards regulating free speech to that extent, we ruin drama, we ruin cinema. Some of the greatest overtures to people with mental disabilities, physical disabilities, have been given to us in cinema by non-disabled people. So it's all about how they're being portrayed. Marlee Matlin has been a great example of someone who has participated in comedy about her disability because she thinks that it's important to make sure that people with disability are not treated as a separate class, but are treated like everyone else. So that is, I think, at the core of what we're discussing here today.
Media commentator John Griffing says the American people are more concerned about serious crime rather than claims against politicians.
Political reality is becoming a lot like reality television, to be quite honest. So much focus has been paid to scandals because it's so easy to distract people from what matters with accusations, in many cases baseless and unproven. This is really pandering to the lowest common denominator. When we're talking about issues that clearly don't matter to the people that actually are pushing them, like let's look at the people who are pushing the sexual harassment controversy with Roy Moore. These are folks that can be heard on any other day defending actual rapists and actual pedophiles, okay? So when we look at that, then we really can have a clear understanding that this is not really about that. It's about the policies that these individuals want to prevent from becoming law. Let's talk about those policies. Let's talk about our policy disagreements, and let's stop throwing mud, because it's really a waste of the people's time.
Imagine the internet as the real estate market. So in this case, the .com domains would be the elite houses, large pompous villas, while all other domains would be, affordable, cheap housing. But regardless, now imagine somebody with bags of cash rolling in and buying off all property in a neighborhood. Easy to imagine that in either case, such individual would have a major say on how things are run in such community. And this is exactly the concern that investigative journalist John Griffing has when it comes to the Chinese buying off those domains.
Now we have a bunch of non-Western countries like Iran who censors the internet, monitors what their people look at online. China, same thing. Competing now against Russia, the United States, Britain, Germany for influence over what has traditionally been a very open, equal, and competitive space. When China gets 51% control of all DNS addresses, it also then can dictate to the rest of us, to Russia, to the United States, what we will see online, how we will consume news online.
But the most bizarre part is that America is doing this to itself, not only signified by Barron's case, but also by letting go of U.S. government's grip on domain name system, or the DNS, last year to a non-profit company called ICANN, which has governments and foreign businesses among its stakeholders.
The American government has stood behind the internet historically, and that's what has made the internet what it is today. So simply restoring that, not going further, not going further back, further forward, but restoring the system we had, I think would do a lot to alleviate these issues.
The current media world is buzzing with everything cyber-related. The story of U.S. giving up its domain assets to foreign governments, however, is not as sexy as unproven hacking allegations.
Everything has become this kind of walking on eggshells, tiptoe exercise in human relationships. And when you have entire groups of African American students at universities saying they want to self-segregate, calling it safe spaces, totally eliminate any sort of other racial intermixing, I mean, that's really kind of cultural reversion. That's going backwards, don't you think? Nobody that's sending their kid out onto the street for Halloween wants to insult a group of people. It's not really about that, and the fact that it's been made about that is just truly tragic.